I'm John Haskell, director of the Kluge Center. We're the host of this event. The Kluge Center's mission, as many of you know, is to support relevant research by bringing scholars into residence to use the vast Library of Congress collections and to connect the fruits of their work to policymakers like yourselves. Tonight, two of the scholars Kluge has brought into residence at the library, thanks to the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation, are the first Library of Congress chairs in U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations, Jim Goldgeier and Minxin Pei. Among many other distinctions, Pei is the editor of the China Leadership Monitor, which is the leading blog followed by academics and practitioners on internal Chinese politics. Jim Goldgeier is co-founder of Bridging the Gap, another Carnegie initiative, which encourages and trains scholars to produce policy-relevant scholarship. There's an idea, academics producing policy-relevant scholarship, including the Bridging the Gap book series at Oxford University Press. Tonight's event culminates a full year of interactions at the staff and member level with these two chairs. Let me recognize Pat Nicholas here, who's program officer at Carnegie, who has spearheaded Carnegie's efforts to bring scholars to the library to interact with congressional policymakers and other people in the policymaking community in Washington. Going forward in 2020, we will follow up with two new scholars bringing programming to you and your boss's attention. I hope you had the chance to pick up information on upcoming Kluge congressional events when you checked in, including dinners like this one on August 13 on big data and policy making, featuring a former Kluge scholar, Martin Hilbert. Don't be intimidated by it. Martin Hilbert is tremendously entertaining, and it should be a very interesting event. It'll be a more interactive seminar. We also have a full fall schedule of public events this fall featuring authors like Evan Thomas on Sandra Day O'Connor, Danielle Allen on the Declaration of Independence, and Francis Lee and former members of Congress on trends in congressional policy making. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, led by Minxin Pei, to begin the discussion. Our third panelist, who I haven't introduced yet, is Oriana Skylar Mastro here, who's a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Welcome, you three.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Minxin Pei. I'm very honored to be the first Library of Congress chair in U.S.-China relations. Tonight, we're going to address one of the top foreign policy issues facing the United States. That is the apparently blossoming Sino-Russian relations. There are many questions about this relationship. The extent of the development, the speed of the growth in this relationship have both surpassed the expectations of skeptics and even people in both countries. So tonight we're going to ask and explore several very important questions. Jim will start off by looking at this relationship from the Russian perspective, how the Russians see this relationship. Is there something real about this relationship? How will this relationship challenge, if not undermine, American interests and values? And then Oriana, whom I've known for many, many years, I do not take credit for her success. I do take credit for spotting her talent many years ago. When I was working at the Carnegie Endowment more than 18 years ago, Oriana applied for a research position as my RA, and I hired her. And since then, she's done spectacularly well. But now, Oriana is a specialist in Chinese military affairs. So she will look at the military cooperation between China and Russia and see if that should raise some concerns to people like us. And finally, I will wrap up with a very quick overview of the growth of the trade and investment relationship between China and Russia over the last 18 years. So, Jim, why don't you go ahead?
Great, thanks, Minxin. Great to be up here with both of you, and thanks to the Kluge Center for inviting me back. I was here through May on the U.S.-Russia chair, and some of you may have been at some of the events that we did this past year on U.S.-Russia relations, and delighted to be back here this evening. So, of course, as you know, the U.S. national security strategy and national defense documents focus on the strategic competition with Russia and China. And I think the most important point that I would make is just to remember that these are not the same country. They are two very different countries. They don't pose the same kind of threat to the United States. China is the country in the world that will pose the major long-term strategic threat to the United States. Russia can certainly create problems. It has created problems domestically, as we are well aware. But it doesn't have the same potential that China has, or that the Soviet Union had before it. And worth remembering that the situation during the Cold War was reversed. The Soviet Union was the main threat to the United States from the late 1940s to the late 1980s. China was the lesser threat. And the point of the so-called triangular diplomacy developed by President Nixon and Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and then Secretary of State Kissinger, was to peel China away from the Soviet Union, something that was already occurring naturally on its own, in order to try to create a favorable situation for the United States. And certainly something we can discuss. There are people today who are arguing, well, if China is going to be poses the main threat, and will continue to do so in the future, should we be doing something to try to peel Russia away so that the partnership does not grow closer? I think that at least when we think about currently what the cost would be for us of trying to do that, I don't think that it's worth it, but it's certainly something we can discuss this evening. I want to say a few words about what Russia has achieved under President Putin, because he's often described as having played a weak hand well, and described as having a weak hand, for a variety of reasons. Russia further from the center of Europe than it's been in centuries, an economy which is 1/12 or 1/13 or whatever, much, much smaller than that of the United States. An economy that's now rather stagnant, overly reliant on oil and gas, which accounts for nearly half of government revenue. Population dramatically reduced from the Soviet period to a population that's now less than half that of the United States, and so on. But he has achieved his major goals of the past 2 decades. He has brought Russia back to being viewed as a great power in world affairs. He's managed to make very clear that he will not accept the movement of countries like Ukraine and Georgia into Western institutions. And I think that he's maintained his hold on power a lot longer than people would have imagined in 2000 when he was first elected. And he presumably views these accomplishments as being in spite of U.S. intentions rather than because of them. Also worth noting that he did not come to power seeking a bad relationship with the United States. I think the thing to note about when he came to power and his view after, and the reason it was different from his predecessor Boris Yeltsin, was that Yeltsin, from the time that he was battling Mikhail Gorbachev for supremacy in those last days of the Soviet Union, was throughout his time pursuing a strategy of Russian integration into the West. Yeltsin and his team were anti-Soviet and pro-American, basically. But the problem was that Russia could only integrate into the West as a junior partner. And being seen as an equal to the United States was important for the leadership in Moscow, I would argue, from the 1950s on. This was something that really was something that drove a lot of what we saw. In the Soviet period, the way they focused on being taken seriously as an equal was to build up the nuclear arsenal to being equal to the United States. Gorbachev and Yeltsin both complained about American presidents not always treating them as equals, and this was something that when you look back at the record, Gorbachev with Bush, Yeltsin with Clinton, constant reminders, you know, you should be treating us as equals, which got harder and harder to do during the 1990s when Russia certainly was not anywhere close to being an equal. And Putin came to power, determined to do something about it, stop the economic freefall that Russia was in the 1990s, stop pursuing a strategy of integration, but I would argue what he sought at the beginning was to pursue a stable relationship with the West, with the United States, in the hope that he would have a recognized sphere of influence in his neighborhood vis-a-vis the West. But he soured on what he saw as American efforts at hegemony, at dictating to others, especially Russia, the U.S. unwillingness to formally recognize Russia as having a privileged sphere of influence, and also what he saw as U.S. regime change efforts. And I think that that really goes a long way toward explaining, from the Russian standpoint, the appeal of the partnership with China, and also why, and something we could talk about, I mean, didn't want to be Russia, it didn't want to be the U.S.'s junior partner. Like, why is it so great to be China's junior partner? And in my view, it's the lesser of two evils from the Russian government standpoint. I mean, they're going to be they're not going to be the equal of either country. So, you know, pick your poison. You know, when a lot of scholars look back at the U.S.-Russia relationship over the past nearly 30 years, there's a big effort to try to paint NATO enlargement as a main contributor of the poor U.S.-Russia relations. But in my view, I mean, the first couple rounds, 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, even 2004, the round that took in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, I mean, it wasn't something the Russians liked. I mean, they were clearly opposed to it. But I would argue it actually paled in comparison to other events that created in Putin's mind the sense that Russia needed to push back against the United States. And certainly we can say there were a whole host of things that the Russians saw as inimical to their interest. The NATO war against Serbia over Kosovo in 1999 launched without UN Security Council authorization, followed by the Iraq war 4 years later, again, of course, launched without UN Security Council authorization. I think it's really important to see those two together, because one of the measures of Russia's great power status after the end of the Cold War was that it still had that permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So if you ignore the UN Security Council, you are diminishing one of the measures of Russia's status. And of course, the aftermath of those conflicts. Milosevic was gone from power the following year. Saddam Hussein was killed, as would Gaddafi be in the 2011 Libya war. The color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan in 2003 to 2005, Putin saw these as instigated by the United States and a harbinger of what the United States might try to do against him, which he did believe was occurring when there were protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, part of the animus that he maintained toward former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. There was the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, which had a statement that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO someday. And I don't think it's an accident that there was a war with Georgia and Russia in 2008, and of course the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which was the proximate cause was more the regime instability in Ukraine and the move toward the EU, but I think part of the same issue. Russia has been constantly concerned about U.S. designs on Ukraine and pulling Ukraine into the West for more than 20 years. In 1997, for example, as the first round of NATO enlargement, first invitations were issued in 1997, Boris Yeltsin asked Bill Clinton for a gentleman's agreement that Ukraine would never become part of NATO, which he didn't get, but he asked for it. He said they should just go into a closet and just shake on it. Clinton didn't go for it. And, so given that Putin's belief that U.S. global hegemony, as he saw it, needed to be undermined, and given his objective of political control, it's no wonder that he sought the closer partnership with China. I mean, it gives him, it gives him a partner that also looks askance at U.S. domination, and certainly does not mind the authoritarian nature of the Russian regime. And of course, you now have, and we'll talk about, things like the new joint air patrols are something that I wouldn't have foreseen, years ago. The level of it, and especially, in the recent weeks, the violation of the Korean airspace is something that I think, is certainly rather dramatic. Before turning it over to Oriana, I just would like to say a few words about the real issue that faces Russia and that's going to shape the future of U.S.-Russia relations and will infuse the nature of the Russia-China partnership. And that is the fact that we are now in what Syracuse University professor Brian Taylor calls late Putinism, as an echo of what we used to call late Brezhnevism in the 40 years ago in the Soviet period. Putin is really in a very difficult situation domestically because he has to figure out what his plan is. If he's going to stay in power past 2024, he's got to come up with a plan. And he needs to have some kind of plan, either staying in power or being assured that a succession would enable him to protect his assets. Much easier to do if he actually stays in power. From the Russian population standpoint, 2024 itself is a long way away, so imagine another 6 years of him after that. I think, Russia has a succession problem. It's had one ever since the Tsarist period. It has not figured it out. In the post-Soviet period, what we saw was, Yeltsin was re-elected in 1996, chose to step down at the end of 1999 and installed Putin as acting president, who then went on to win in 2000, who then decided that 2 4-year terms, as it was then in the Constitution, was not sufficient, made the move to put Dmitry Medvedev as president, and he took the prime ministership, and then came back 4 years later, had the Constitution changed to have 2 6-year terms, and of course he's in that second 6-year term. So now what's the move for 2024? Uncertain. Even if you believe he's going to stay in, there's still a degree of uncertainty, and that creates a real problem domestically, because he's not the only one who's thinking about protecting his assets. All those people around him that he has enriched, they're also thinking about protecting their assets. And so they need to know what the plan is, or else they need to be looking at who else can be there to protect their assets. And so the potential for instability at the top, I think, is much higher than most people think, and that will be Putin's focus, for the rest of his time in office, whether that's 2024, 2030, or sooner. And I think that's, from a U.S. perspective, I think that's really why maintaining the sanctions on Russia is so important. There have been a lot of people who have looked at the sanctions and thought, well, they were designed to change Russian behavior. They didn't change Russian behavior, so they didn't really work. And I would say, no, they're working. They have put a dent in the Russian economy. It leads to greater dissatisfaction with him, and it produces much greater challenges to him than would otherwise be the case. So make sure they stay on.
Good. Oriana.
Thank you, Minxin. It's really great to be up here with 2 of my mentors and now colleagues to talk about this very important topic. So it might be my military background, but the first thing I always like to do is give a bottom line up front in case people decide that they're tired after a long day of work and now their bellies are full of food and they don't want to listen anymore. So this is the main takeaway that I'm hoping you get from my talk, which is I think it's overblown the concerns about China and Russia and their security cooperation. but I don't think we're concerned enough about it. Okay, so how does that make any sense? I'll run this through for you. United States military objectives in East Asia are already seriously compromised by Chinese power. I can go through contingencies for you over Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Korean Peninsula, in which the United States military already does not prevail. Now you want to add in a possible Russia component to that, even if it isn't an alliance, even if it isn't really deep security cooperation, even if it isn't even the minimal amount of interoperability. And I don't think we are prepared to deal with thinking about Russia in these contingencies. As far as I know, we don't think about Russia in these contingencies. When it comes to protecting Taiwan, for example, we don't ask ourselves, well, what happens if we also have Russian aircraft in the air? If China is trying to establish de facto control over the South China Sea, and there's also Russian vessels there, how do we deal with that? And so the space is already so difficult for the United States to maintain a military advantage and continue to be able to operate in what we call the first island chain, which is basically the geographic area between the coast of China that goes past Taiwan to where Japan is and then the Philippines. That then you want to tell our military planners and strategists they also have to possibly consider Russian cooperation and a contingency, and we are in big trouble. So, to move back, let's talk a bit about the type of security cooperation that we have seen and what is potentially significant and how it can move forward. I think it's obvious that the two sides have been closer than ever. Putin and Xi have met 7 times over the past year, twice as much as previous years. The two have met about 5 times a year since 2013. By comparison, Xi Jinping has met with their US counterparts almost half that time, since 2013. And Putin has met with US presidents about 8 times since 2013. So at least we see that there seems to be more political interaction that could lead to more agreements, more coordination. And on the military side, we have seen some notable trends in these two sides working together. So in 2016, the two sides established a joint Navy command system, which Chinese sources say is akin to the US, like the NATO Link 16. Now, Chinese sources always like to exaggerate the degree to which they're doing things well, but it does suggest that they have practiced, Russia and China, a degree of joint command and control type of systems. The thing that really made the headlines last year was a Russian exercise, Vostok 2018, and this made headlines for a number of reasons. I mean, the first one is it was the largest Russian military exercise. And the second was that this is the first time the two sides exercised a scenario that wasn't counterterrorism, but was an interstate war scenario that included joint defensive and counterattack operations, the type of operations that the two sides might do together in a Korea scenario. And I've written, and I'm happy to talk more in the question and answer, I've written extensively about China's contingency planning for Korea. And I will tell you already, just because of geography, and I tell the US military this as well, they do not like it, but because of geography, there is no debate about whether or not, we get there before China does. China can take about 80% of North Korea, as well as their nuclear facilities, before we even think about positioning forces in the region. So then you add Russia to that, it would be very difficult for the United States to achieve our objectives in that contingency. So I looked at these type of things, these military exercises. There's also been notable arms transfers. I mean, traditionally, before the past few years, I basically saw China wanted 3 things from Russia. It didn't want real cooperation. It just wanted weapons, it wanted access to energy resources, and it liked the fact that Russia had the same vision of the world order, pushing it back against US hegemony. Chinese reliance on Russian weapons have gone down significantly. Exports have dropped from about 50% in 2006 to about 8% now, and that's because China has always had the plan. China made in 2025 about stealing our technology. They're very happy to steal everyone's technology. So with the Russians, they do the same thing. They would buy the arms from Russia, and then they would reverse engineer them and produce them themselves, which would sort of always upset Russia. But now they're pretty good at that, so they don't rely as much on the arms sales, though the Chinese have taken control of some Russian-made S-400s, which is an air defense system, a very advanced air defense system. So I look at these types of exercises, and actually, I think they're kind of overblown. Even kind of the joint exercise, you can say things are joint, but in practice, they aren't really. The United States, even with our allies and partners, has a very difficult time having a degree of interoperability and actually working together in a combined way. My favorite thing is when states want to do kind of joint exercises. China does this a lot. They do search and rescue exercises. All that is you like throw a man in the water, and then together you get him out of the water, and then you can say you did that thing together. So a lot of this is really overblown, and even that big exercise that happened in September, to me, the fact that most of the Chinese coverage on it was in English suggested that they really want to use this more as a messaging tactic to the United States. And whenever they do kind of interact with the United States, or in track 1.5s that I've been in, they always bring up the Russia card, kind of like, well, we don't like what you're doing, and if you keep on doing it, we might become closer to Russia. So I think part of it is to try to get the United States to tone down its own rhetoric on China. So up until very recently, a lot of this didn't really concern me, and I kind of waved off concerns about Russia-China military cooperation. And what I realized after, and Jim mentioned this about the long-range bomber flights, about the joint patrol that happened in South Korean airspace. This was a big surprise to me for two, and it made me realize that I had some assumptions that maybe were not true. So the first reason it's a surprise to me is, as you know right now, South Korea and Japan have this spiral of tensions between them. And China usually tries to create a wedge in the alliance by bringing in South Korea and alienating Japan. And so it seemed confusing to me that they would kind of upset South Korea with this kind of patrol. They didn't seem to be taking advantage of the situation in the way that I would have expected. So that's the first thing that confused me. And the second thing that really confused me was the fact that this had occurred at all, because what I realized was my assumption was we don't have to worry about Russia and Asia because China doesn't want to cooperate with Russia in Europe. China actually, its ideal situation is that Russia helps China achieve its objectives and that China doesn't have to reciprocate because it doesn't like to see itself actually as a partner of Russia. China sees itself as a legitimate, strong, prosperous, rising power. And sure, the two autocratic countries, but China does not like to see itself like, they see Russia as a sort of illegitimate, decrepit system. That's not what they are, right? They are a nation of rejuvenation. So I always thought that was a huge obstacle to the two sides coming together because I thought China, of course, wants Russian support for its growing competition with the United States, but it's not really willing to give the same to Russia outside of international institutions because it continues to see a close relationship to Russia as somewhat of a liability. China has no appetite for any international crises that they aren't creating and controlling themselves. But this joint air patrol made me realize one thing that I had assumed that maybe was incorrect, and also Jim referred to this, which is maybe Russia's okay with an asymmetric relationship. Maybe they're okay with things not being equal. And if that's the case, if Russia's willing to kind of support Chinese security objectives in Asia without expecting the same degree of coordination and support to the West, then I think that opens up a whole new level of possibilities for the role that Russia can play in Asia. So I always thought that was the main limitation to a stronger Russian role. I used to always say about the Korean contingency, people would ask, is Russia going to be involved in this? And I used to say, China won't let Russia be involved. Because China determines and thinks it determines the degree to which the Russian military can be involved in its sphere of influence. But now if China's welcoming that, then we have a real problem. So to conclude, what are some of the areas of concern that I have? The first is that the North Korea issue seems to be getting more complicated if China and Russia are coming closer together. In the past, China hasn't really been open to leveraging Russia, I think, greatly in the North Korean issue. But now I think they're shifting their strategy a bit. And that's partially because of the tensions with the United States, but also partially because I think they're losing their grip of influence on North Korea. Because North Korea has been on this active diplomacy situation, right? Kim Jong-un, for I think the first 6 or 7 years of his time, never left the country. And now he has met with the South Korean president, he's met with the US president, he's met with Putin. He's been in Singapore, met with those leaders, Vietnam. All of a sudden, he's sort of branching out, and he no longer has to interact with the outside world through Beijing. And so because of this, Beijing has had to adapt its strategy to try to continue to have influence over this denuclearization process. And it seems like one way that they've done that is they've tried to more closely coordinate with Russia. And they've done so politically. I mean, both sides, for example, believe that sanctions relief is kind of a right way to go with North Korea to get them to continue to negotiate. And so Russia has supported some things that China likes on that in the United Nations, for example. But now I wonder, given that joint exercise, if even in the military security realm we might see more cooperation there. And that's going to be problematic for the United States that obviously wants to be in the driver's seat on these negotiations to figure out what is the right amount of pressure and assurance that we need to give North Korea to move forward. China and Russia both like to take intimidating actions towards Japan. There doesn't seem to be a lot of coordination on this, but both countries do have territorial disputes with Japan, and so this might be one area that is worth watching to see if we see closer military security coordination to put pressure. For example, every year the Japanese put out a white paper in which they tell you how many times they had to intercept Russian aircraft and how many times they had to intercept Chinese aircraft. You know, it's a very big number, but what if all of a sudden, like this joint air patrol, the Chinese and the Russians are working together on this? I think that can be very problematic from a Japanese perspective. Now, I know I'm talking about military and security issues, but political and diplomatic power is important. I think it is important. Some people might disagree with that. But, you know, the United States hasn't done a great job, I think, at leveraging international institutions to really show that we're willing to lead this US-led global order. And, you know, Russia might want to completely get rid of that order. China, in many cases, benefits from it, so they want to be able to revise the parts that they don't like, build alternative orders when it's to their benefit, but also support the ones that they do. And so Russia seems to be very supportive of a lot of Chinese efforts to gain power through these international institutions and direct those institutions in a way that's beneficial for them, which includes making the world safer for autocracies. Right. That's a big thing for all these countries. So the Chinese have used the term strategic echoing to describe a nature of indirect coordination, even if China and Russia don't meet and coordinate, that there's a tacit understanding that if one country takes one action, these institutions, the other country will support them. Another thing I would be concerned about if I see Russia and China cooperating on missile defense or any sort of nuclear issues, if they work together to achieve common goals in third parties, that, I think, would be a sign that this type of cooperation is reaching a new level, or allow each other to operate from each other's territories. So if we see Russia granting China naval access to some of their ports, or we see China granting that to Russia, I think this would indicate a level of strategic cooperation that would be very problematic to the United States. And just recently in April, the Russian ambassador to China invited Beijing to help develop Arctic shipping routes and promised gas supplies in return, and so we might see that kind of cooperation. So in the end, I think, it depends on the day of the week how I feel about this Russia-China relationship. I think it is too hyped up based on what we've already seen, but because it only takes a very small amount of cooperation between these two sides to seriously complicate the U.S. ability to achieve its objectives in the security and military realm in Asia. What this means is it's something that I think we very much need to avoid. So I'll conclude with that.
Thank you, Oriana. I will give you a very quick overview of the development of Chinese-Russian economic relationship, starting with trade. Until about 30 years ago, China and Russia hardly had any trade. Because the two countries did not reach some kind of rapprochement until Gorbachev visited China in 1989. And during the 90s, the Russians sold China only weapons, and China sold Russia mainly consumer goods. But in the last 18 years, this trading relationship began to grow very rapidly. In 2000, this is the number, bilateral trade was only $7 billion. As of last year, bilateral trade reached $107 billion. So we're seeing an annual compound growth rate of more than 10% per year. Still, it pales in comparison with Sino-American trade, which was more than $670 billion last year alone. And when you look at the kind of things that they sell to each other, it's quite apparent that the two economies are very complementary. That is, they are not competitive. China produces things Russia does not produce. And Russia sells to China things China does not produce. Mainly, when you look at the composition, that is, China sells to Russia mostly manufactured goods. We're talking about 80%, 85% of Chinese exports to Russia. As for raw materials, I think that's mostly agricultural goods. On the other hand, Russian exports to China, 75% are oil and mineral products. And the rest are capital goods, manufactured goods, and intermediate goods. So it's not economically a competitive relationship. In terms of trade balance, roughly equal. For a while, China sold more to Russia, but now Russia, as of last year, Russia had a positive trade record, trade balance. But when you probe the numbers deeper, you will find that it is a lopsided economic relationship in the sense that Russia needs China economically much more than the other way around. China is Russia's largest trading partner. Russia is China's number 11 trading partner. So you can see the Russia actually, the Chinese-Russian trading volume is less than the Chinese-Vietnamese trading volume. Just think about the relative importance, and even less than Chinese-Indian trading volume. So that's one. And the other one is China is Russia's single largest export market in terms of country. Collectively, EU buys more from Russia, but in terms of single country market, China is the largest for Russia. China accounts for about 12% of Russia's total exports. And China is Russia's largest purchaser of its energy products. And in terms of energy, again, the two countries have really overlapping interests. China has for a long, long time tried to diversify its energy supplies. China had this problem so-called the Malacca dilemma. That is, most of China's oil comes from the Middle East, and if something happens to the Malacca Strait, China's oil access will be blocked. So China has been working very hard to get energy alternative suppliers from Central Asia and from Russia. Now they are getting quite a bit of chunk of their energy supplies from Russia. So this is a trade. And the takeaway is that it's complementary and it's growing very fast, but it's also lopsided. In terms of investment, actually not much is happening on the investment front. Considering in recent years, China has become a huge exporter of capital, but Russia is not the place where Chinese investors would like to go. As of today, China, as of 2017, total amount of Chinese investment in Russia was $16 billion. Just to put this in perspective, Chinese investment in the US is $67 billion. Russian investment in China is only $300 million. So there's not much investment from the other in the other direction. And when you look at other aspects of economic exchange, mainly cultural exchange, tourism and exchange students, Chinese tourists have now become a global phenomenon. If you go to Europe, if you go Southeast Asia, the biggest group of tourists are Chinese. But for Chinese tourists, Russia is relatively small, sort of insignificant destination. Only about 500,000 Chinese tourists go to Russia on an annual basis. For the U.S., and U.S. is much far away. The U.S. every year gets about 3 million Chinese tourists. In terms of students, in the U.S., I'm trying to give you the comparison between the two sets of relationships. China has more than 350,000 students in the U.S. In Russia, the number of Chinese students is about 27,000. So it's, again, a fraction. And the other way around is that Russia has about 18,000 students in China. So my observation is that it is Russia needs China much more than the other way around, as I said before. And then the two economies are not in the same difficult situation as the US-China economies, because US-China economies used to be complementary, now they are competitive. So we see a lot of trade tensions. So economic relationship between Russia and China is unlikely to be as contentious as the US-Chinese economic relationship. However, there is one danger that going ahead, the fact that the terms of trade, which is that depending on whether you sell, one country sells more high value added goods to another country, because the terms of trade favor China. Over time, you should expect the politicization of Sino-Russian trade in Russia, because you can expect Russian politicians, especially after Putin, I would say, pointing their fingers at China, say this is a country that is engaged in unfair trade because they sell us manufactured goods, we sell them raw materials. So that's, and also this relationship is not, this commercial relationship is not underpinned by dense and significant cultural social ties. The US-China relationship, when you look at it, is at one level you see enormous tension, but at the social cultural level, the two countries are so deeply intertwined. But that's not the case with China and Russia. Looking to the future, I would say that the prospect of their future growth is actually very limited. That's because Chinese growth is slowing down. And as the Chinese growth slows down, China's demand for Russian oil will also slow down. And Russian growth is not going to pick up either. So we're going to see, because trade is highly correlated with economic growth. So that these two factors, Chinese slowdown and Russian stagnation, will limit the future of their growth in commercial relationship. The other factor is both are autocratic countries, regimes, that have very poor protection for property rights, and that limit the amount of investment, especially from China, that can be made in Russia. I have not looked at who have been making these investments, but I suspect mostly they are state investments, investment made by state companies in China, not private investors, because private investors, if they go to Russia, they will fear for the security of their investment. And when the third limiting factor is that in terms of technology, Russia really does not have a lot to offer China. Where China falls short is really American technology, semiconductors, very advanced manufacturing technologies, and also software. These are the areas Russia does not have an advantage in. So on that front, we're not going to see further cooperation. But where are we going to see Chinese and Russian governments engage in more active economic cooperation? topping their agenda is what I would call de-dollarization. That is, both countries have now identified as their top national economic priority and national security priority the reduction of the role of the dollar in the international economy. Because the dominance of the dollar in international finance is now seen, and the willingness of Washington to use to weaponize the dollar has now convinced both countries to explore ways. It's very difficult to do, but they are. I think for Russia, Jim may supply the Russia and China now denominate an increasing amount of their trade in RMB rather than dollar, so that they can bypass the U.S. payment system. And China has recently opened the only non-dollar oil trading platform in China. So these are the initial signs that this is something they're going to invest a lot of efforts and resources in. Another area that I see some form of cooperation going forward would be in fundamental research. Because Russia has very good scientists in the fundamental research area, and China is actually quite weak in the area. And third is that natural resources exploration will continue to be an area they will find a lot of common ground in, because China still needs the stuff and Russia needs the capital to develop. And infrastructure investment, because China has this huge huge program called Bridge and Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia could possibly benefit from this. And lastly, I think we might see both countries engage in cooperation in the space programs, because that's again an area in which China has enormous ambitions and Russia has really a huge amount of expertise and experience. So we'll just stop here, and we have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you...
And Xing, I want to interrupt for 1 second just to say that we are taping the panel for future posting on the Library of Congress and Kluge websites. We will be cutting off the cameras for all of the question periods, just so you know.